Great to be here with everybody this morning. I'm covering all the little critters that you can find in your soil, all the invertebrates in your soil this morning. So we're going to take a deeper dive into those groups right now. And as Stephanie mentioned, soil contains a vast diversity of life. Nearly 25% of all the organisms found on the planet are soil animals. So it's really an incredible source of diversity. These animals range from absolutely microscopic to totally visible to the naked eye to quite large. One way to think about and visualize the abundance of life in the soil is this illustration here. This represents the life found in a square meter of soil. It's not to scale, but as you can see, the smallest organisms, the bacteria and the fungi, make the base of this pyramid. They're the most abundant. And then as soil creatures increase in size, fewer and fewer are found within that square meter. And soil life needs creatures both big and small. All this life exists within this really intricate web with all these different organisms dependent on one another for survival. There are a number of ecological roles that soil animals can play. Decomposers are those that break down plant and animal material into pieces that bacteria and fungi can more easily use. The smaller the particle of leaf material, for example, the more niches and pores that bacteria can occupy to continue to break it down further. For example, the population of bacteria increases significantly on plant material after it passes through the gut of a soil animal. So these decomposers animals are really a critical part of the decomposition process. There are also soil animals that enrich the soil, animals that tunnel or burrow in the soil, mix nutrients and minerals between soil layers, and that influences soil fertility as well as soil structure. Those burrowers and tunnelers are soil engineers. Their work also carries air and water into deeper layers of the soil, which helps to aerate and hydrate the soil. They create channels within the soil that allow plant roots to penetrate a little bit further. Plant roots really like to grow through the path of least resistance, for example. So their work is really essential to the structure of the soil as well. And then, of course, there are also a lot of different roles that soil animals play within food webs. They can be herbivores or plant eaters. They can consume fungi or bacteria, or they're predators of other soil animals or parasitoids of other soil animals. And Steph mentioned some can be pollinators as well. So there is just a ton of life happening underground. And because much of it is happening out of our sight, we are really going to spend some time showcasing some of these animals and their role in soil health. We're really going to particularly focus on those organisms that contribute to agricultural soil health today, but recognizing that there are a lot of other soil invertebrates out there that play a role in other soils as well. We're going to start with the smallest of organisms that you can find in soil. The protozoans are less than 1 millimeter, so they're very much viewed only with microscopes. And protozoans in the soil used to be considered animals, but now they have their own kingdom of their own entirely. These are single-celled organisms that are mobile and obtain food from other sources. They can't create their own food. They move in different ways, and that's how we group these different groups of soil protozoans. Amoeba have cytoplasmic extensions that they use to move themselves along. Testate amoeba move the same way, although they have a harder shell that surrounds their cytoplasm, and they just stick their little extension outside of the shell a little bit at a time. The ciliate amoeba have little hair-like extensions that are cilia that help them move, and the flagellates have one single whip-like extension that they use to propel themselves around. All protozoans in soil primarily feed on bacteria as well as fungi and algae as well. And as they feed on bacteria, primarily they release nitrogen, and importantly, in a form the plants can more easily access. So a lot of the nitrogen that can be found in plants comes from protozoa that help to transform it. Protozoans are found from deeper, shallow soil layers, as well as deep, and as deep as 200 meters. So they are really some of the organisms that exist in as deep as we know. Moving into soil invertebrates. So that protozoans are the only group that are not animals that we're talking about today. And from here on out, we're focusing on soil animals that are invertebrates. And that covers 99% of all the animals that are found in soil. And Stephanie mentioned invertebrates are animals without backbones. In just a second here, I think I've got an issue with timing on my slideshow. So just 1 minute. All right, so soil invertebrates are animals without backbones, and most of this group are made up of insects. About 80% of soil invertebrates are insects. But to suffice it to say, soils are really home to some of the most diverse communities of animals that you can find on the planet. So jumping into some of these invertebrates, these are rotifers. They live in water films along with protozoans, and they are also best viewed with a microscope. They can be recognized by their crown of cilia that are found towards the head. They use these to spin and create this vortex that they use to draw in food. They eat bacteria and protozoa, fungi, and algae. In fact, their name Rotifer comes from the Latin word that means wheelbearer. So those wheels are really quite distinctive for rotifers. They have a little foot, which you can't really see here, but a foot-like thing that they use to anchor to surfaces when they want to hold tight, or that they can use to scoot around within the water film. Water plays a very important role in the world of rotifers. And when that water dries up, they form a cyst-like structure, which is a stage of resting animation that allows them to survive in that dry conditions. So that's really important for soil rotifers to make it through dry spells. Another group that's found in water films and that are also microscopic are tardigrades. And tardigrades are known as water bears as well. And as you can see from these microscopic pictures here, they do superficially resemble bears. They've got stubby legs and claws, and the way that they move is really a little bit lumbering, like the mammal bears that we know. Tardigrades eat slightly larger animals than rotifers do. For example, they'll feed on nematodes and rotifers, as well as bacteria and protozoa, fungi, and plants and algae as well. And they too really depend on that water film for their survival, and can also enter a state of suspended animation when that water dries up. Most of the water leaves their body, their metabolism slows way, way down, and they can be very long-lived in that cryptobiotic state. In fact, up to 30 years, but possibly more. There have been a number of folks that have experimented with revitalizing tardigrades from old museum specimens of moss, for example. Tardigrades are quite possibly the most resistant and hardy animals that we know of on the planet so far. They are really resistant to radiation. They can survive really extreme temperatures, anywhere from negative 250 centigrade, all the way up to 150 centigrade. They are also the only known animals that can survive without oxygen in the vacuum of space. So these are incredibly hardy animals that are pretty ubiquitous in our soils. Our next group are nematodes, and these are among the most numerous animals on the planet. There's a quote from an agronomist in the 1920s who worked with the USDA, and he said that if we took all matter off the face of the planet, we could still see the outlines of mountains and the lines of lakes just by the film of nematodes that would be left behind. And so this is another group that's really omnipresent in soils. And nematodes are unsegmented worms. They're fairly transparent and they're tapered at both ends. Nematodes have a wide range of food sources, and the mouth parts help you to distinguish what they eat. In this illustration here on the left, you can see a nematode that has lips that grasp bacteria, so it's a bacterial feeder. In the middle, you've got a nematode with piercing, sucking mouth parts that puncture and suck roots or fungi. And then on the right, this nematode is a predator and has teeth to help hunt rotifers and tardigrades and other nematodes. Nematodes live in water films within the soil or within pores if they're larger in size. Many nematodes are microscopic, but some are visible to the naked eye. Nematodes develop from eggs, and they have 4 juvenile stages before they become an adult. And many species have separate sexes. Some have both sexes within an individual and hermaphroditic. Just like tardigrades and rotifers, they depend on water films in the soil for gas exchange. And when that water dries up, they can also enter the stage of cryptobiosis. Nematodes in particular can survive a long time in this state, much more than we realized. Just a few years ago, in fact, scientists revitalized nematodes from glacial deposits that they estimated to be about 30,000 years old. So absolutely incredible that they can survive that long. Nematodes can be found as deep as about 2.2 miles in the soil. And some of the plant feeders that feed on roots can cause damage, economic damage to crops like soybean and rice and corn. There are also some nematodes that are internal parasites of other invertebrates as well as vertebrates. And then as you can see in this picture here, this is a little bit unusual, but there are a few fungi that will actually trap nematodes and prey on nematodes. This particular species of fungi right here forms a constricting ring around the body of the nematode and then breaks it down slowly over time. Soil nematodes can be important indicators of soil quality. Their presence correlates with nutrient cycling and plant growth, and they can also be really sensitive to chemical disturbances and physical disturbances. The only downside with using nematodes as indicators is that there aren't very many people who can identify free-living nematodes. Our next group of invertebrates are potworms. So these are slightly larger worms that you can view with the naked eye. So they're much larger than many nematodes. They're typically white. They're segmented, so they have segmented bodies. And potworms are smaller than earthworms in size. They really live in the upper soil layer, and they feed on decaying material, as well as bacteria and protists, and they influence soil structure through their burrowing and mixing of organic matter and minerals. So they are ecosystem engineers on a small scale. A more familiar group are quite likely these earthworms. They are also segmented worms and have a tube-like body, just like potworms. Unlike potworms, they're quite a lot larger, and they do have a structure known as the clitellum This is a structure that houses reproductive organs. If you've ever wondered which end of the earthworm is the head versus the tail, look for that smooth band. That's the clitellum, and it's found closest to the head. So earthworms burrow within soil. They consume leaf litter as they go, as well as actual soil itself. And their burrowing action, as well as their digestion of soil and leaf litter, can improve soil porosity. It increases water infiltration. It transforms nutrients. They can move an incredible amount of soil. One estimate is that they can move 10 tons per acre per year of soil. So earthworms obviously have some pretty significant benefits. It's also worth mentioning, though, that there are a great number of earthworms found in the United States that are introduced species, about 1/3. It's thought that glaciation removed a lot of the indigenous earthworms found in the central portion of the United States. So it's really only the Pacific coast and the eastern states and southern portion of the east that have native earthworms. In all those places where we have native earthworms, as well as those places where we had no native earthworms, we now have lots of different introduced species of earthworms that have been here for any number of years, introduced by European settlers. And then we have some species that were introduced more recently. And some of these species might be beneficial in some settings, and some might be detrimental in others. For example, there's a group of introduced species known as the Asian jumping worms, and this is at least 15 different species of worms. These worms can deplete leaf litter, and they also aren't mixing nutrients within soil layers as some other earthworm species do. So their presence actually increases erosion and causes nutrients to be lost from the soil, as well as reducing habitat for other species that rely on that leaf litter layer. So this is all to say that earthworms are not always the superstars of soil health in every single place and in every single setting. All right, from here on out, we're going to focus on groups of invertebrates known as the arthropods. These are invertebrates that have an external hard skeleton on the outside of their body. They also have segments in their bodies, and they have jointed appendages. There are really 4 large groups of arthropods. There are the hexapoda that include the insects. There are the myriapoda that include millipedes and centipedes. There's Chelicerata that includes spiders and mites. And then lastly, the crustacea, which include wood lice and crayfish. And because arthropods do have an external skeleton on the outside of their body, as they grow, they need to shed that external skeleton in order to continue to get larger. And different arthropod groups go through different transformations. There's 2 general types of metamorphosis. Incomplete metamorphosis have those groups that go through incomplete metamorphosis have young that look very similar to the adult. And they also feed on very similar food sources, and they're found in similar habitat. So this includes arthropods like mites and spiders, and then insects like true bugs and grasshoppers. There are also groups that have complete metamorphosis, and these include insects like beetles, ants, and flies that have life stages that look very different from one another. So they go through 4 distinct phases: egg, larva, pupa, and adult. And in each stage, they look quite different. They can live in different habitat. And the 2 feeding stages, the larval stage and the adult, often have different food sources. So that's just background as we go through some of these groups. And particularly when we get to the insect groups, we'll talk about what the different life stages need for those groups that have complete metamorphosis. So our first group of arthropods are mites. And Mites have two main body regions. They have a large abdomen and a small cephalothorax area where it holds their head and their locomotory structures. Mites have 8 legs, 6 as immatures, and their lifespan can vary quite a lot by species. They usually look pretty small and have those rotund bodies. And what's really amazing about mites is they can be one of the most diverse groups in the soil. They're also one of the most abundant. So about 40% of all the small arthropods that you might encounter in the soil are mites. And they are super decomposers. They are really essential for breaking down organic materials into bits that bacteria will use. So this includes plant matter, but can also include animal matter that's already started the decomposition process. They break it down even further. There is also a group of mites in the soil, the mesostigmata mites, that are predatory on smaller soil life like springtails and nematodes or insect eggs. And as they're moving through the different soil layers, because mites can be found not just at the soil surface or in the upper soil layers, but also in deep layers, they move fungi and bacteria as they travel through the soil layers, and that is important as well. I mentioned that mites have different lifespans that can vary. Some have very short lifespans of just a few weeks. Some can live longer, up to 3 years. And that can just vary with all the different species. Mite faunal communities can be very specific to soil type. So if you've got a specialist soil on your land, it often has very unique mite communities. Mites they don't have wings. So if they want to travel long distances, the way that they often travel is by hitching a ride on insects. You can see in this picture here, this is a darkling beetle, and it's got a group of mites hanging on to its legs. This might look like these mites are parasites of this particular beetle, but really they are just traveling from place to place by clinging on to that insect. And the last thing I wanted to mention is because of their close ties to the soil, tillage does reduce the work of predatory mites that might contribute to crop pest control. Our next group are springtails. Springtails get their common name from a structure that they have on the underside of their abdomen, seen here with this orange arrow. This is a furcula, and it really is just a propelling structure that moves these animals across and through the soil in a springing motion. Many columbella or springtails are globular and have this round rotund body, and a few also have a more elongated body, like you can see in the upper picture here. Some springtails live in deep soils, and those springtails have often a reduced furcula, reduced spring, and also have lost their eyes. And within, whether they're in soil, deeper layers, or they're up on the soil surface or within the leaf litter layer, they contribute to decomposition by fragmenting plant material and fungi, but they also eat bacteria and rotifers and nematodes, and through this predation, they can influence soil microbe communities to a significant extent. Our next group are wood lice. This is the only group of crustaceans we're going to talk about today. Most crustaceans are found in water, and wood lice are one of the few that have moved on land, but still water is very important to them. So wood lice are typically only found in moist areas under logs and stones and moist soil. They appear to have armor almost. They have 2 pairs of antennae, 7 pairs of legs, and you may have known them, or at least I knew them as roly-polies growing up. It's pill bugs that can roll into a ball, but there are also sow bugs, which look very similar to pill bugs, except they are unable to roll into a ball. And they can be distinguished by the two appendages that stick off of the tail end of their body. Wood lice are really important decomposers. Not only do they break down detritus, plant material that's already undergoing decomposition, but they also break down fresh plant debris and have bacteria in their gut to help them break down that fresh plant debris. And some even have particular preferences of the species of fresh leaves that they like to chew. A few also will feed on roots or seedlings and can sometimes be problematic in that context. Like earthworms, a good portion of the species that we have in North America are introduced originally from Europe. So about 1/3 of the wood lice species that we have in North America are introduced from Europe. And this includes all of the roly-polies, all of the pill bugs. In fact, native wood lice tend to be more diverse in North America in littoral areas, along shorelines, in caves, and then also in the south. And for similar reasons as earthworms, it's thought that glaciation had some role to play in reducing diversity of wood lice. Wood lice actually live for several years, so they have a longer lifespan. And interestingly, too, the mothers provide maternal care and actually feed their young with secretions from their own bodies. Another really interesting thing about this group is that they can tolerate heavy metals and they accumulate them within their body. So if you're looking to monitor contaminants within a system, monitoring wood lice and looking at their bioaccumulation can tell you something about the contamination levels. Now we're going to turn to some larger, significantly larger arthropod groups, physically larger anyway. These are millipedes, and these have very elongated bodies. They have segments, of course, too, and they have 2 pairs of legs per segment. So this gives them this appearance of having many, many, many legs. And in some cases, they do have hundreds of legs. Though their name millipede means 1,000 feet, there actually is no millipede on the planet that has 1,000 feet. The upward limit of feet for millipedes is about 750, which is still a lot. Millipedes have chewing mouth parts, and they use these chewing mouth parts to break down plant materials in particular, and they are really super decomposers. They are responsible for fragmenting up to about 15% of annual leaf fall, for example, and they significantly facilitate microbial decomposition. Millipedes are also really powerful diggers, so they can excavate deep soil tunnels in which they overwinter and rear young. So they contribute to soil health in a couple different really important ways. This is another group that can be long-lived, and significantly so. They can live up to 11 years. So they do reproduce a little bit more slowly. And the females also provide some form of care for their young. For example, they might guard the nest or help bring food for their young. Closely related to millipedes are centipedes. They look quite similar, although their segmented bodies are often a little bit more flattened. They're not quite as round, and they do have fewer legs with only 1 pair per segment. And another striking difference of centipedes is that instead of chewing mouth parts, they have pincer-like piercing mouth parts that they use to inject venom into their prey. So these are all predatory rather than decomposers. They'll live in all layers of soil as well as on the soil surface, hunting their prey. And they can be very excellent hunters. Many are nocturnal, and they can be quick at running and quick at tracking down their prey. Centipedes can also be quite longer lived and will also provide care for their young. Another important group of predators are spiders. Spiders have two body regions like mites. They have an abdomen and they have the cephalothorax, their head and their thorax that's combined. They have 8 legs and they have multiple eyes. And spiders can also inject their prey with venom to slow them down or to start digesting them, and can also be useful diggers as well. And the spiders that we often see the most are hunting spiders that are found on the soil surface or in leaf litter. These are spiders like wolf spiders or jumping spiders or ground spiders. But there are also other spiders that live in the soil that use webs that they spin either across the soil, or they create a tunnel or tube within the soil and line it with silk, in which they trap and then ambush their prey within their web. And spiders can be fairly long-lived, anywhere from 1 to 3 years. They can be slow reproducers. They only have 1 generation a year. They do overwinter in the soil, either as adults or eggs, as well as in leaf litter or in old stems. And for this reason, they really rely on permanent plantings in agricultural settings. So they can't really survive within an agricultural field from year to year because there's too much disturbance. But if they have permanent habitat nearby, they can move back into the agricultural field in the springtime. Because they are long-lived and take a little while to reproduce, disturbances like insecticide applications or tillage can impact their populations. It can take them a little while to recover. Spiders also provide maternal care, and you can see in this picture here, this is a wolf spider, female, and it's a little hard to tell, but she's carrying just a ton of babies packed on her back, and she'll carry them around for quite a while. And let's see, I think that's it for spiders. All right, Liz, if you wouldn't mind opening the chat, we're going to have a question for you, and I think we want to hear from you. Have you thought about soil invertebrates in your work today or in your life today? And if so, if you could tell us a little bit about how. We'd just like to hear from you about your thoughts on soil invertebrates. Okay, we've got some good responses coming in. Thank you so much. Folks have thought about them in their compost or in work with farmers and ranchers for soil health. Some folks mentioned that they just have known about earthworms. I think earthworms are certainly a gateway animal into the rest of soil invertebrates. Some folks have thought about them in the nutrient cycle. That's wonderful. Wondering about how to provide habitat for them, and certainly we're definitely going to talk about that a little bit later. Food for birds, that's for sure. They're food for a lot of other animals. Trying to boost spider populations, that's wonderful. Leaving leaves. Yeah, thank you so much for all these responses. All right. Okay. Next up. So from here on out, I'm going to just be covering insects only. We've talked about a lot of different groups of arthropods, and then we've talked about a lot of other groups of invertebrates, but from here on out, we're focusing on insects. And insects are those animals that have 3 body regions, they have 3 pairs of legs, and they have 1 pair of antennae. And not all insects have wings, but many do as well. The head section of insects include the mouth and associated parts for food manipulation and sensory organs. The thorax, the middle section, contains the locomotion organs and structures needed, legs or wings. And then the abdomen contains internal organs and reproductive organs and so forth. And as Steph mentioned, there's a huge diversity of insects on the planet. And although we have estimates of about 1 million to 1.5 million species identified so far, some people estimate there's about 5 million species of insects out there, and we just haven't discovered them or identified them properly and named them properly. So there's a lot to learn about this particular group of animals. And there are a ton of different groups of insects that live in the soil or that have a portion of their life cycle in the soil. I mentioned earlier that 80% of all soil animals are insects. So there's a lot of insects out there, and we are not able to cover them all today. So pictured here are some of the groups that play a role and live in soil, like burrower bugs or grasshoppers, cockroaches, termites, antlions, cicadas, earwigs, and mole crickets. But we're really going to highlight those groups that are most important and have special value to working lands on farms today. I'm going to start with flies, and for the sake of time, I'm grouping a whole bunch of different flies together. And this particular group of flies are all important decomposers of plant material. As larvae, they break down decaying plant material in the soil and can make really notable contributions to the decomposition of leaf litter. These flies include crane flies, which you can see pictured up here in the left-hand corner, which are often mistaken for really large mosquitoes. They do look somewhat similar, but have very different lifestyles. And then we have dance flies here, non-biting midges, long-legged flies with their metallic bodies, and they're often found on flowers. Moth flies, which can be found near damp areas typically. March flies, this is the larva stage of the march fly in the adult. And then snipe flies, which have this gorgeous yellow patch on their back. Some of these flies as adults do visit flowers for nectar. Some need nectar to keep their energy going, and some actually don't feed as adults. But all in all, I just wanted to make them point that there are quite a diversity of fly species out there that are really important in soil systems as decomposers. Another important group of flies are the flower flies. And these adults are often found on flowers where they drink nectar or sometimes pollen. They have a coloration that can sometimes mimic bees or wasps, usually fairly brightly patterned. Their larvae, though, are gray-green, they're legless, they're pretty unassuming, but they're absolutely really pretty powerful. In this particular picture here, you can see a little larva that's hunting an aphid. Some flower fly larvae live within the soil or leaf litter and break down decomposing plant material. Others are predators within leaf litter or soil, hunting other soil animals that are small. And then some do move up onto vegetation and hunt animals like aphids. So this is a group that contributes to decomposition, but also is important in the control of crop pests and can provide conservation biological control on farms. They're also, as adults, I mentioned that they visit flowers. This is a group that it can be very important pollinators of crops as well. They're, in fact, one of the most important non-bee pollinators of crops. Flower flies overwinter in the soil or leaf litter. And because of the close relationship that adults have to flowering habitat. They need some sort of permanent flowering habitat in order to survive, because pollen and nectar are so important to survival and to reproduction. And moving into the beetles, this is another group that contributes to crop pest control and as well to potentially to pollination. The adults have leathery wing covers and elongated bodies. The larvae, on the other hand, have dark, elongated, soft bodies, but really hard, sickle-shaped jaws. It's the, the larval stage that are often really important hunters in the upper soil layers and in leaf litter. They will also hunt prey on plants. They hunt for smaller insect legs or smaller insect larvae, like aphid, or insect larvae, as well as small insects like aphids, but they will also eat larger soil animals like slugs or snails. The adults also can be hunters, but many just consume pollen and nectar. And in this way, they're often found on flowering plants, and as they move between those flowering plants can sometimes transfer pollen. So soldier beetles do superficially resemble this next group that we're talking about. These are the fireflies. Fireflies also have these leathery wing covers, and they have luminescent segments at the end of their abdomen. Both the adults and the larvae have luminescent segments, and they use those organs to attract mates by flashing patterns at dusk and at nighttime. The larvae are predatory, and they're very good hunters. They will seek through leaf litter, upper soil layers, and occasionally tracking down slugs by following their slime trails or searching earthworm burrows to track down earthworms. So this is a really interesting group in that I think they have this lesser known connection to the soil that can be really important. Also, the larvae do tend to overwinter in the soil, as well as potentially under bark, and pupation can occur in soil leaf litter. So they're all the fireflies that we see flashing, showing their beautiful shows in the Northeast and other parts of the country, that is all tied to the health of the soil as well. Our next group are tiger beetles. Tiger beetles have smooth wing covers, quite long legs. They have really prominent eyes. They're often metallic in color, so they can be very colorful. Some are more gray, but often still have a metallic sheen to them. So those are the adults. The larvae, on the other hand, are a little bit more cryptic. They burrow in the soil. The adults start out by laying eggs within a burrow in the soil, and then the larvae usually dig further into the soil to create this burrow. They will anchor themselves in. You can see they've got a little anchor. So they'll anchor themselves to the side of that burrow. They've got a flat head, and they will usually hide these massive jaws that they have underneath that flat head. So they look a little bit innocent. And then as an unsuspecting animal crawls by, they will pop out and pull them into their burrow and consume them. And these larvae are actually pretty long-lived. They can take 2 to 3 years just to mature into adults. So they spend a lot of time in the ground developing. The adults, on the other hand, are also predatory, and they actively hunt on the soil surface and sometimes on plants. They are very, very fast. They can be. And in fact, one species of tiger beetle is the fastest known insect on the planet and runs equivalent of 5.6 miles per hour. So they are very speedy and pretty hard to catch if you've ever wanted to get a closer look. Related to tiger beetles are ground beetles. They look quite different, but have a lot of other things in common. Ground beetles have ridged wing covers. They're a little bit larger than tiger beetles. Often they are not metallic, they're more often dull colored, black or brown. The larvae, however, do have massive jaws, just like tiger beetles, and both the adults and the larvae are excellent predators. They can be particularly important in consuming and controlling crop pests like slugs and snails, grasshoppers, herbivorous beetles, caterpillars, and so forth. This is a really important group in conservation biological control. Not only do they have this important role as predators, but there are some species that also contribute to decomposition by breaking down detritus, and some that also eat weed seeds. So this is a really valuable group to have on your land, whatever that land looks like. And ground beetles lay their eggs in the soil, and then some females will provide some care and look out for those eggs, defending them. And I mentioned that the larvae and adults are both predatory. They hunt and eat similar types of prey. Most are most active at nighttime. This is a long-lived species as well. They can live up to 4 years, and they do have slow reproduction with just one generation a growing season. So that means that insecticide kills or tillage in particular, because that can disrupt their eggs and their overwintering, and can have big impacts on their population that can take a while for them to recover from. They also overwinter in well-drained soil or in clumps of bunch grass. And for that reason, they don't persist within a cropped field, for example, over time, because they need that permanent habitat. So what some growers have experimented with is actually creating habitat within a crop field for these beetles, because they're so important in pest control. And this habitat is known as a beetle bank, and it's a small earthen ridge that's maybe 2 to 5 feet wide, raised slightly and planted with bunch grasses that runs the length of the field. Ground beetles will move into that habitat in the fall and overwinter, and then move back into the crop in the spring. Our next group are Rov Beetles, and Rov Beetles have very similar habitat needs and very similar prey as ground beetles do, so they're found in very similar places. And they also respond to similar conservation measures. However, they do live deeper in deeper soil layers than ground beetles do. They do have short wing cover, so that's a quick way to distinguish them from ground beetles. And they will often elevate the tip of their abdomen when they're running. Those Rov beetles that live in deeper layers of soil often have even more reduced wing covers as well. These beetles are really quick runners. They're good hunters, and they eat all sorts of things. So they'll eat all sorts of different soil animals, mites and slugs, small to large, and will also eat some detritus and contribute to decomposition as well. Because they do move within the soil quite a lot, they can contribute to mixing of soils as well. Our next group of beetles are the burrowing beetles. This includes 2 groups of beetles. The burrowing beetles that you see at the top have more elongated bodies with red, orange, and black coloration. And then there's a group related to them known as carrion beetles with a more round body, and that's more often black with a little bit of yellow or orange on its thorax. Both of these beetles feed on carrion. They're really experts at finding carcasses and can find them really quickly, identifying them from up to 2 miles away. Because carrion is considered to be a hot commodity for a lot of different animals, carrion beetles try a couple different strategies to keep their carrion protected and reduce competition for it. Carrion beetles lay their eggs directly into the carrion as it lies, and they develop pretty quickly, but their larvae will also eat fly larvae that might be competition for the decomposition of that animal carcass. Burying beetles will actually dig beneath the carcass and cause it to sink in the ground, and then they'll lay eggs on it after they cover it up. So in that way, they're trying to reduce competition as well. The decomposition of carrion is particularly important because carrion is so nutrient rich that it can really influence soil fertility significantly, as well as all the plant communities nearby.
Hey, Jennifer, this is Liz, just with the 10 minutes till break time check-in. Thanks.
Appreciate that. So I mentioned that burying beetles will move it to a better spot. They will bury their carcass to protect it. They'll move it if they need to a better location to help them dig. But as they're digging it beneath it, they process the carcass. So they take away the hairs or the feathers or whatever is there. They're destroying any fly larvae that might be competition. They shape it into a ball, and they also secrete a whole bunch of substances onto that carcass to slow down microbial decomposition so that it serves as a better food source for their young. And they can bury it fairly deep, as much as 60 centimeters or more. And then they'll lay their eggs on it. The larvae that then develop are fed by their parents that regurgitate food. And that type of parental care, in which not just the mother as well as the father are contributing, is really pretty unusual in insects. The larvae of carrion beetles, on the other hand, pictured here at the bottom, they are not quite so helpless. They are not fed by their parents. They're kind of on their own, and they feed on the carrion as fast as they can. They also, I mentioned, will feed on fly larvae or other small beetle larvae that might be competitors for that. Both groups overwinter in the soil and pupate in the soil. And this isn't, I mentioned earlier that mites will hitch rides on different insects in particular to move from place to place. And this is particularly notable for carrion beetles and burying beetles because the mites can get exactly where they want to go, which is to get to carrion, where they also will feed on fly larvae or small beetle larvae. And then they'll just hang on to the adult carrion beetles as they move on to the next carcass. Next up are dung beetles. Dung beetles have this oval body and scalloped legs, which they are used for digging. The larvae are C-shaped grubs that are found within dung. This is another group of beetles that's really good at finding their food source. They're really excellent flyers. For example, they can fly up to 30 miles, can identify dung from quite a long ways away. And they're really good at removing dung. They can remove it in some cases up to a day or a few days. It's estimated that dung beetles remove about 1 ton of dung per hectare per year, which is a huge amount of dung. So their work is really, really critical for the health of grazing lands. It improves the palatability of forage for livestock. It also reduces the habitat for parasites of livestock. So screwworms and hornworms often develop within dung. And so the very presence of dung beetles breaking down that habitat reduces parasites of livestock. They also disrupt dung feeding flies that carry E. coli. So this reduces the spread of foodborne pathogens on farms as well. So there's all these incredibly valuable services that they provide on farms as well as grazing lands. This is estimated to be worth about $380 million a year. It's almost certainly worth more than that. Dung beetles have a couple different strategies for securing dung because it is, like carrion, a hot commodity with lots of animals competing for it. Those that are dwellers lay eggs directly in the pat and will also kill fly larvae that are competition. So in that way, they reduce those pest flies I mentioned earlier. There are those dung beetles that will dig a tunnel beneath the pat and then move dung into those tunnels. And then there are the rollers, which are perhaps most well-known of dung beetles, that form a ball with the dung and then move it away from the pat before digging a nest underneath and moving that dung into that nest. Dung beetles can be fairly long-lived, up to 3 years, and some develop a little bit more faster than others. Dung beetles, because they feed on dung, anything that is applied to the cattle that moves through their gut and into the dung can affect dung beetles, including parasitic treatments like ivermectin, which can be very harmful to dung beetles. And that in turn can prevent their ability to decompose dung. One more quick fact about these dung beetles: the rollers need to move their rolls as fast as possible away from the dung patties to reduce competition, because there are other dung beetles that will try to steal their balls and all sorts of other things. It's only been recently discovered that they use polarized light from the sun and take sort of a mental picture of the sky to help them find the most efficient and fastest route, but they can also use other celestial cues when it's darker, including the moon and even the Milky Way. Our next group are ants, and ants have, just like bees and wasps, constricted waists and elbowed, in particular to ants, they have elbowed antennae. Ants live in large colonies and build extensive nests underground. Their excavation and mixing of soils makes them one of the most significant insects found in the soil. For example, in Massachusetts, one study found that ants moved through 30 tons of soil per acre per year. So they are moving a lot of soil. And in this process, they're integrating nutrients, helping to aerate, hydrate, and they also play other roles in the food web. They're predators. They contribute to plant decomposition and animal decomposition. They move seeds. This is just a really superstar group. I mentioned they live in large colonies. Ants have a truly social lifestyle. So there's individuals in the colony that perform specific roles. The queen is the primary reproductive role, and it's the queen that establishes a nest. She finds the site, and then she produces brood, her young, and those grow into workers that care for the colony and are working as foragers or soldiers or nurses or other roles. So these colonies are multiple year colonies and can be really extensive. In this picture in the top left, this is a plaster cast of an ant nest taken by the man in the picture, Walter Tinkle. These nests can be up to 12 feet deep and can have tens of thousands of workers within them. He called them nature's grand architects. And one quick note about a particular group of ants found in the Northeast. There's Formica species. These are mound building ants. They can build these slightly raised mounds that are about 2 to 3 feet in diameter and raised about 1 to 2 feet. Sometimes they're really essentially earthworks, and you can find them in grasslands as well as forests. There are a lot of other critters that live within ant nests as symbionts or just receiving benefits from being present within the ant nest. But they never are harmful to the ant nest, only providing receiving benefits from being there, and sometimes providing some benefits as well. Next up are our ground nesting bees. 80% or so of all the species of bees found in the US nest in the ground. These can be fairly shallow, a few centimeters up to 1 meter or more, depending on the soil type, because different species have very specific preferences for soil types. It's the female of bees that provision these nests. They create these nests and then provision them with pollen and nectar. And in gathering enough pollen and nectar to feed their young, they make many, many trips between flowers. And that is one of the reasons that bees are such really critical pollinators, not only of crop plants, but also of wild plants. Ground nesting bees can nest in agricultural fields. In this picture here, you can see several nest openings. This is within a sunflower field, and each of those nest openings leads to the nest of an individual. So most species of ground nesting bees are solitary, and the work to build a nest is just done by one individual. So it's not this extensive colony situation as you see in ants, although there are some species, as Stephanie mentioned quite early on, that bumblebees can be soil animals as well. And most bumblebees do form more social colonies, but much smaller than ants. So in this picture, you can see the work of one individual solitary bee. She's dug this deep tunnel that leads down to separate chambers. She's probably got about 10 chambers, depending on how much time she has to excavate them and then provide them with food. Inside the chamber, this is a ball of pollen and nectar. That's food for her young. She'll lay an egg on top, and the larva will develop on that ball of pollen and nectar. Many ground nesting bees will secrete a substance to line their nest, just to create sort of a waterproof protection around their young to help them survive fluctuating soil moisture. Some bees have just one generation a year, so you could only find them flying in the spring or the fall, for example, depending on when they emerge, or some have multiple generations and you can see them throughout the growing season. And then there are also some bees that specialize on the pollen of a particular species of plant or on a closely related group of plants. And pictured here are squash bees, which is a genus of bees, or actually several genera now, that do visit plants only in the genus Cucurbita for pollen, and so have a very closely tied life cycle to Cucurbita plants and can be very important for the pollination of pumpkins and squash and zucchini and so forth. Closely related to ants and bees are wasps. And much like ground nesting bees, there are a number of ground nesting predatory wasps, most of which are solitary. This solitary lifestyle means that they aren't aggressive in defending their nest. They aren't likely to sting unless their life is threatened in some way, as in you step on them or accidentally grab them and squeeze them. But they're otherwise not going to defend their nest. They're not going to fly around and try to sting you in any way. These, unlike bees, are predatory. They feed their young arthropods like grasshoppers or crickets, aphids, stink bugs, caterpillars, and so forth. Some focus on a specific group and have particular preferences, like the sand wasp down here at the bottom tends to prefer things like stink bugs. The cicada killer wasp pictured in the right-hand corner focuses on cicadas only. But others are more generalists. This is another important group for conservation biological control. They can really significantly contribute to crop pest control. It's the adults that are found on flowers and drink nectar, and they are the ones doing the hunting, but it's the larval stage that are the predatory stage and actually consuming those insects. Lastly, another group of wasps that are important to conservation biological control are scarab hunting wasps. These adults drink nectar and found on flowers, and the females then hunt for scarab grubs. So they'll dig down into the soil once they've found scarab grubs and lay eggs nearby, and then their young eat the scarab grubs slowly over time in order to develop into adults. So all these different groups that I've been talking about so far, I've been highlighting all the beneficial roles. There are a couple of groups that eat living plant material as well, so they might feed on roots. And in some cases, this includes groups that can be crop or ornamental pests. This includes scarab beetles, wireworms, which are the grubs of clickworms. It can be grubs of weevils. And there are also a few groups of moths that have caterpillars that feed on plants. So these are herbivores. And as I mentioned, some can cause economic damage, but in a balanced system, there are also all these other predatory groups that I've talked about that help keep these herbivores in check. And that also goes for other groups that have some members that can be crop pests, like snails and slugs. About 20% of snails and slugs can contribute to crop. It can be significant crop pests. But groups like ground beetles and fireflies, Rov beetles, soldier beetles, these are also really important predators of slugs and snails. And then for good measure, even though they don't really play a role in soil health, working lands, I wanted to mention the periodical cicadas because they are having an emergence this summer in the east. Periodical applies to cicadas that are in the genus Magicicada, and they require 13 or 17 years to complete their development. They live underground for that time, feeding on tree roots, and then they emerge en masse in the springtime, usually about May or June. And the adults will climb on the trees and then sing this really cacophonous song to help them find a mate. And then they'll start the whole life cycle over again, laying eggs in trees, and then the larvae drop down from the canopy and bury into the ground and feed on tree roots for another 13 to 17 years. So it's a really incredible life cycle. I just wanted to highlight briefly. All right, so Stephanie mentioned earlier that really soil animals do so many things for us. They have a huge influence on our lives. They break down plant and animal material. They take complex chemicals and transform them into simple compounds. They can alter soil structure, mixing nutrients, improving water infiltration, and all of those actions enhance plant productivity, which is hugely beneficial for those of us raising crops for food or for shelter, for fuel. They help contribute to climate regulation. They control the populations of other wildlife, they're food sources for wildlife, and they contribute to pollination. So really, they're hugely foundational for our life above ground. And hopefully we've given you this snapshot of some of this amazing life that's happening below ground.